what's your take on is inflation coming down? Or
Well, clearly the rate of increase has slowed. If you want to call that inflation is coming down, it's increasing more slowly than it has been. But compared to recent history, it's still way above anything that most people would like to see. Yeah, I mean, the Fed has indicated last week that they're slowing their rate of increase. In other words, the Fed essentially fights inflation by raising interest rates. The interest rate they control is called the federal funds rate, which is the rate that banks lend money to each other on the overnight market. And the Fed had been increasing the Fed funds rate at a basically a 3/4 of a point rate. So for the last three times the Fed met, they increased the rate by 0.75%. So the rate is now in the range of about 4%. And so last week, the Fed announced that instead of doing another 3/4 of a point increase, they're going to do only a 0.5 point increase. And so the markets are taking that as news, good news, that the Fed perhaps is coming to the end of its cycle of tightening and raising interest rates. Although Chairman Powell has suggested that the end is not yet in sight, that while they're slowing the rate of their increases, they may keep the rates higher longer than they originally had anticipated back last year. So, I don't think we're out of the woods yet. The inflation has slowed, or the pace of rate, the rate of increase in inflation has slowed. The Fed has backed off on the pace at which it was fighting inflation. And I think the Fed is sort of taking a wait and see approach that, we may have done enough. Monetary policy is sort of one of those, I think there's the quote from Milton Friedman is that it works with long and variable lags. And so, it's not entirely clear, how quickly higher rates do the job of containing inflation. And we're in a very uncertain environment, how much of inflation is due to, monetary policy, how much of it is due to, the war in Ukraine and COVID lockdowns in China. So, there's multiple factors that are affecting inflation. And the Fed only has one tool to fight both of them. And it's, the interest rate tool works better on monetary policy than it does on, broader economic supply side issues. And so, the Fed is essentially saying, look, we may have done enough. It's not clear. We see some slowing in the pace of inflation. That could be good news. We may be, the end may be in, so we may be at the beginning of the the beginning of the end, as the Churchill quote goes. But I think it's still too early to tell. There are just too many wild cards out there. The war in Ukraine and COVID are both big wild cards. I mean, nobody knows how that's going to play out. And if you get another resurgence, you get more lockdowns in China, although they seem to be backing off on their sort of absolute lockdown policy.
Well, that's kind of like be careful what you wish for, because they're not well vaccinated. And so what could happen is you get a country that suddenly there are people that can't come to work because they're sick rather than lockdown. So it could be that we still have a ways to go with that.
Yeah, clearly there's a lot of unknowns right now. And I think it's just too early to tell. I mean, if you look at the financial markets, short-term interest rates are now higher than long-term interest rates. That's what they call an inverted yield curve. And traditionally, inverted yield curves are signs of an imminent recession. Most people are discounting that. They're saying, no, that, this time the labor market is still strong. But again, the labor market being strong and wages rising are indicators of continued inflation. And so the Fed is really, they're trying to do a balancing act of containing inflation without causing a recession. And, the markets right now are giving the Fed the benefit of the doubt. I mean, the fact that the 10-year rate is, it's now down to, I think yesterday was like 3.6%, and, which is below the short-term rates. The markets, by that indication, think that in 10 years, inflation is going to be certainly, at the target, the Fed's 2% target. And the markets may be right, but The markets are not always right.